Imagine this: a man with eyes wide open, staring at the world as if he had discovered a secret no one else could see. His mustache, twisted into sharp, upward curves, became almost as famous as his paintings. And in his arms, not a dog, not a cat, but an ocelot. A wild animal, spotted, elegant, purring like danger itself. This was not just an eccentric millionaire showing off. This was Salvador Dalí, an artist who turned life itself into a performance. In 1965, a photograph captured him holding his beloved pet, Babu. Dalí looked directly at the camera, his face a mix of comedy and menace, as if daring the world to question him. To some, he was a genius. To others, a madman. But for everyone, he was unforgettable. And behind that carefully staged image lay a deeper story, the journey of a man who refused to be ordinary. Dalí was not just an artist. He was a master of attention. He understood something most painters never realized: that the world doesn't just consume art, it consumes spectacle. He painted melting clocks, burning giraffes, impossible landscapes, but he also painted his own life with the same brush. Every gesture, every word, every scandal, carefully designed to leave the public stunned. But how does someone become Dalí? How does a boy born in a small Spanish town grow into one of the most famous and controversial figures of the 20th century? His life was a storm, full of obsessions, betrayals, and brilliance. And every chapter reveals something both fascinating and disturbing about the man who called himself the Divine Dalí. From the very beginning, Salvador carried shadows. His parents gave him the name Salvador after their first son, who had died before Dalí was born. He grew up believing he was not just himself, but a kind of reincarnation, a replacement. Can you imagine the psychological weight of that? To live thinking you are the echo of a dead brother? That strange belief would shape his entire identity. Dalí later said he felt destined for greatness, but also haunted by a sense that he was never entirely real. As a child, he was fragile, sensitive, but also manipulative. He learned early that shocking people gave him power. If he acted strangely, if he exaggerated his fears, if he created drama, people would pay attention. And attention, for Dalí, was the most addictive drug. He once said, "I don't do drugs. I am drugs." It wasn't just arrogance. It was the truth. Being around Dalí was intoxicating, confusing, unforgettable. He could make you laugh, disturb you, or leave you wondering if he was insane. And he liked it that way. The world, of course, was not ready for someone like him. Spain was still a conservative country, trapped between old traditions and modern dreams. Dalí did not fit. He never wanted to fit. Instead, he created his own world, a surreal world, where ants crawled over diamonds, where time melted into dreams, where even the laws of physics bent to his imagination. And that photo with Babu, his ocelot, was more than just a quirky image. It was a declaration. Dalí wanted everyone to know he lived differently. Where others had cats, he had a jungle predator. Where others smiled politely, he widened his eyes into madness. Where others followed the rules, he burned them and made art from the ashes. But beneath the spectacle, beneath the theatrics, was a real man. A boy who once stood alone in front of a mirror, whispering to himself that he was destined for greatness. A young dreamer who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. Salvador Dalí would not only change art, he would change how we think about reality itself. And it all began with a child who believed he was not entirely human, but something stranger, something larger, something eternal. In the small town of Figueres, Spain, little Salvador Dalí grew up surrounded by contradictions. On one side, the warm Mediterranean sun and the comfort of a middle-class family. On the other, an almost unbearable sense of being different, too fragile, too eccentric, too much. From his earliest days, Dalí seemed like a boy who had stepped out of another world. Neighbors whispered about him. He was delicate, with pale skin and large eyes that rarely blinked. He cried easily, demanded attention constantly, and staged dramatic scenes for no reason. To outsiders, he looked spoiled. To those who knew him better, he was unsettling. The boy didn't simply play, he performed. And yet, he was adored. His mother, Felipa, treated him like a fragile treasure. She believed he was destined for greatness, protecting him from even the smallest discomfort. She fed his imagination, praised his drawings, and encouraged his fantasies. But his father, a strict notary, was the opposite. Cold, severe, and determined to crush any sign of weakness. This war between indulgence and discipline shaped the young Dalí's psyche. He learned to manipulate love, to survive punishment, and to turn every situation into theater. Dalí himself once recalled that as a child, he enjoyed provoking people just to see their reaction. He would burst into uncontrollable fits of laughter at inappropriate times. He would suddenly start crying in public, not because he was sad, but because he loved the way people rushed to comfort him. For him, emotion was not just feeling, it was performance. But behind the performance hid darker impulses. At just 6 years old, Dalí pushed a friend off a bridge, not out of hatred but out of curiosity, to see what would happen. When the boy fell into the water, Dalí felt no guilt. Instead, he stared, fascinated. These disturbing episodes would follow him through life. A strange mix of cruelty and innocence, genius and danger. At school, things weren't easier. He was intelligent but arrogant. He wore clothes that made him stand out, acted superior, and often claimed he was destined to be famous. The other children laughed at him, bullied him, and called him crazy. But Dalí didn't care. In fact, he loved it. Every insult became proof that he was different. Every push or punch only convinced him further that he was not meant to live an ordinary life. Then came his discovery of art. One day, while sketching in class, he realized something extraordinary. When he drew, people stopped mocking him. They stared. They whispered. They admired. Suddenly, Dalí had found his weapon, not his fists, not his words, but his imagination. With a pencil, he could control the world. His mother nurtured this talent. She bought him art supplies, encouraged him to study great masters, and filled his head with the idea that he was special. For a boy who already believed he was the reincarnation of his dead brother, this was like pouring gasoline on fire. Dalí began to believe not only that he could be great, but that he was chosen. Still, the world outside didn't understand him. Teachers complained he was lazy, distracted, arrogant. Other students despised him. But Dalí only leaned deeper into his strangeness. He grew his hair longer, wore unusual clothes, and exaggerated his gestures. Every hallway became a stage. Every classroom became an audience. He was not just surviving childhood. He was rehearsing for the role of Salvador Dalí, the man who would later shock the entire planet. And yet, beneath the drama, there was loneliness. He often felt isolated, disconnected from his peers, trapped between a mother who adored him and a father who seemed ashamed of him. This conflict brewed inside him like a storm, feeding both his insecurity and his need to be seen. By the time Dalí entered adolescence, he already knew one thing with certainty. He would never be ordinary. He would either become a genius remembered forever, or a madman lost in ridicule. To him, there was no middle ground. As Dalí grew into adolescence, his eccentricities did not fade, they intensified. By the time he was a teenager, the small streets of Figueres could barely contain him. He was flamboyant, erratic, and obsessed with standing out. He strutted through town in clothes far more extravagant than those of his classmates. While others blended in, Dalí painted himself as a character, wearing bright ties, strange hats, and a cape that made him look like he had stepped out of another century. People laughed. Some mocked him openly, others whispered behind his back. But Dalí thrived on it. Every insult became fuel, every laugh an echo of the spotlight he craved. He didn't just want attention, he needed it, as if being ignored was the same as ceasing to exist. At home, the tension between his parents only grew. His mother continued to spoil him, convinced he was destined for greatness. His father, however, grew harsher, demanding discipline and seriousness. When Dalí disobeyed or behaved outrageously, his father punished him severely. Yet Dalí responded not with shame, but with rebellion. The stricter his father became, the more extreme Dalí's behavior grew. This rebellion followed him into the classroom. Teachers described him as talented but insufferable. He refused to follow rules, challenged authority constantly, and often turned lessons into theatrical performances. Once, when scolded for disrupting class, Dalí stood up, stared his teacher in the eye, and declared, "You will speak of me one day, not as your student, but as a genius you failed to understand." The room fell silent. To some, it was arrogance. To Dalí, it was prophecy. Despite his defiance, his artistic skill was undeniable. He drew obsessively, filling pages with strange, haunting images that revealed both technical brilliance and psychological depth. His classmates could barely keep up. Dalí didn't just draw objects. He distorted them, stretched them, gave them dreamlike qualities. What for others was a simple exercise became, in Dalí's hands, an experiment in bending reality. But his behavior often overshadowed his talent. In one infamous incident, he showed up to school wearing outrageous clothes and announced to his peers that he was going to be more famous than Picasso. The statement was absurd for a boy his age, but he meant it. He wasn't joking. And in his own way, he was already preparing to make that claim a reality. When the time came, Dalí's parents sent him to study art formally at the Academy of Fine Arts in Madrid. It was supposed to discipline him, to refine his raw talent, to turn the eccentric boy into a serious painter. Instead, it only gave him a bigger stage. At the Academy, Dalí quickly became a sensation. He was brilliant, producing paintings that stunned both classmates and professors. But he was also infuriating. He openly mocked his teachers, claiming they were too narrow-minded to understand true genius. He refused to take exams, arguing that the judges were unworthy of evaluating him. When professors tried to discipline him, Dalí doubled down, arriving to classes dressed in elaborate costumes and reciting long monologues as if he were on stage. The Academy wanted discipline. Dalí wanted chaos. His classmates were divided. Some admired him, others despised him. But nobody could ignore him. His presence was magnetic, his ego impossible to contain. He surrounded himself with other eccentric minds, poets, filmmakers, rebels, who encouraged his wild imagination. Late nights were spent discussing art, philosophy, and the future of Spain, while Dalí painted feverishly, producing works that were both beautiful and disturbing. Yet, even among the avant-garde, Dalí stood out as something more dangerous. He wasn't content to experiment quietly. He wanted to provoke, to shock, to leave people unsettled. His art was no longer just an escape from loneliness. It was becoming a weapon, a declaration that he would not be ordinary. And when the Academy tried to put him in his place, Dalí responded in the only way he knew how, with defiance so bold it would soon explode into scandal. By the early 1920s, Salvador Dalí was no longer just a promising student at Madrid's Academy of Fine Arts. He was a storm the institution could not control. His works were dazzling, his imagination boundless, but his defiance had reached a breaking point. Professors whispered that he was brilliant, yes, but also unbearable, reckless, even dangerous. The moment that sealed his fate arrived in 1926. Dalí was scheduled to take his final exams, the culmination of years of study. Students prepared nervously, anxious about their futures. But Dalí? He walked in with an arrogance that silenced the room. When asked to present his knowledge, he didn't comply. Instead, he declared boldly that none of the professors were competent enough to examine him. The audacity shocked the faculty. Some thought it was a joke. Others felt it was an insult so severe it could not be ignored. To Dalí, it wasn't arrogance, it was truth. He genuinely believed that his vision exceeded that of his teachers. That day, instead of receiving a diploma, Salvador Dalí was expelled. Most students would have been destroyed. Years of study wasted, a career in jeopardy. But Dalí thrived on chaos. To him, being expelled was not a failure, it was liberation. The academy, with its rules and traditions, had tried to cage him. Now, free from those walls, he could paint without restraint. And paint he did. Dalí plunged headfirst into experimentation, creating works that shocked even the avant-garde circles of Madrid. He devoured influences, Impressionism, Cubism, Futurism, and twisted them into his own unsettling visions. His paintings no longer just imitated the world. They warped it. Everyday objects became grotesque, dreamlike, impossible. But scandal followed him everywhere. In one exhibition, visitors were horrified by his depictions of distorted bodies and surreal landscapes. Some critics praised his genius, others called him a fraud. Yet Dalí loved the controversy. Every insult, every scandalous headline, fed the persona he was carefully building, not just an artist, but a figure larger than life. It wasn't only his art that drew attention. His behavior became just as provocative. He strutted through Madrid in eccentric outfits, his hair slicked back, his mustache beginning to take shape. He turned himself into living theater. People stared, whispered, laughed, and he basked in it. But expulsion from the academy wasn't just about rebellion. It marked the moment Dalí fully embraced his destiny. He no longer sought approval from professors or critics. Instead, he sought immortality. He wanted to be remembered not as a student, but as a revolution. It was around this time that he began forming connections that would shape his future. Writers, filmmakers, and poets gathered around him. Among them were figures who would later become icons of the Spanish avant-garde. Together, they explored ideas that blurred the boundaries between reality and imagination. Late-night discussions turned into radical experiments. Dalí's paintings grew more bizarre, his visions darker and stranger. And yet, beneath the bravado, something deeper was stirring. Dalí's obsession with dreams, with the subconscious, with the irrational. These ideas weren't just eccentric. They were dangerous. They tapped into the same forces that were shaking Europe: political upheaval, cultural rebellion, and the looming shadows of fascism and war. Expelled, ridiculed, but utterly unbroken, Dalí had taken his first step toward becoming the figure the world would never forget. From the ruins of his academic career, he was forging something far more enduring. A personal mythology built on provocation, scandal, and genius. Soon, destiny would call him to Paris, the beating heart of the art world, where his eccentricities would collide with the most radical thinkers of his time. And in that collision, the surrealist movement would find its most dangerous champion. Paris, 1926. The city was alive, pulsing with creativity, chaos, and revolution. Writers filled smoky cafes, jazz spilled out of dimly lit clubs, and painters transformed canvases into visions never seen before. For Salvador Dalí, recently expelled from the academy in Madrid, Paris was not just another city. It was the center of the universe. Here, he would meet the men and women who would both crown him as a genius and condemn him as a heretic. Among them was Pablo Picasso, the titan of modern art, the Spaniard who had already changed painting forever with Cubism. To meet Picasso was like touching Olympus itself, and Dalí knew it. He arrived with a portfolio full of daring works, his confidence overflowing. Friends arranged the introduction. When Picasso laid eyes on Dalí's paintings, the moment was electric. Picasso, famously blunt, studied the canvases in silence. Finally, he muttered, "Yes, yes, this is something." For Dalí, those words were not just praise, they were a coronation. He later confessed, I left Picasso's studio with the absolute certainty that I was destined for greatness. But admiration did not mean submission. Dalí was not content to follow in Picasso's shadow. Instead, he began carving his own path, blending influences from Freud's psychoanalysis, dreams, and his own obsessions with sexuality and death. His works exploded with bizarre juxtapositions, soft bodies, hard landscapes, melting forms, twisted desires. It was in Paris that Dalí collided with the Surrealists, the radical group led by André Breton. They were artists, poets, and thinkers who sought to unlock the unconscious mind, to use dreams as weapons against the logic and order of bourgeois society. They saw themselves as revolutionaries, not just in art, but in life. At first, Dalí was embraced as their prodigy. His paintings seemed to embody everything Surrealism stood for. The persistence of memory, with its soft, melting clocks, would later become their holy icon. But Dalí's personality, his hunger for fame, his shameless love of scandal, was too much even for them. In the cafes of Montparnasse, debates raged. Some Surrealists called him a genius, others a clown. Breton himself nicknamed him Evita Dollars, a cruel anagram of Dalí's name that mocked his obsession with money and fame. But Dalí laughed it off, because, deep down, he wanted exactly that: dollars, fame, immortality. Still, in those early Paris years, Dalí was unstoppable. He painted feverishly, his works shocking and mesmerizing audiences. Exhibitions drew crowds that gasped, argued, even shouted in anger. One critic called his art the delirium of a madman. Dalí embraced the insult. "The difference between me and a madman," he famously replied, "is that I am not mad." His eccentricity grew bolder. He arrived at gatherings in outlandish costumes, delivered cryptic statements to journalists, and staged stunts designed to grab headlines. To Dalí, the performance was as important as the painting. Art was no longer confined to canvas, it was life itself. But beneath the theatrics was a cold, calculated ambition. Dalí understood that Paris was a battlefield of egos. Picasso, Breton, Moreau, they were giants, and he had to outshine them all. Every provocation, every scandal, every painting was a step in that war. And yet, Dalí was not entirely alone in his madness. In Paris, he would also find something, or rather, someone, that would define his life even more than fame or fortune. A woman named Gala, who would soon become his muse, his lover, his obsession, and his curse. For now, though, Dalí stood in Paris with his eyes blazing, surrounded by rivals, allies, and enemies. He was the new comet in the art world's sky, brilliant and terrifying, promising both light and destruction. The Surrealists had welcomed him, but they did not yet understand. Salvador Dalí would not just join their movement. He would devour it. In the summer of 1929, Salvador Dalí's life was about to fracture into two halves, before Gala and after. She entered like a storm. Her real name was Elena Ivanovna Diakonova, a Russian woman who had already lived through revolution, exile, and a failed marriage. By the time she met Dalí in Cadax, she was in her mid-30s, 10 years older than him. She was intelligent, manipulative, magnetic. And Dalí, the eccentric boy genius craving love and validation, fell at her feet. For Dalí, Gala was not just a lover. She was the answer to his deepest fears and fantasies. He once confessed, "She was destined to be my gradiva, the one who moves forward, my victory, my wife." But Gala was not a gentle muse. She was demanding, dominant, and fiercely pragmatic. From the first days together, she reshaped Dalí's life. She encouraged his eccentricity, polished his persona, and most importantly, she protected him from his own fragile psyche. Where Dalí was anxious, paranoid, and often insecure, Gala was unshakable, ruthless when needed. She became not just his muse, but his manager, his negotiator, his shield. Their union was scandalous. Gala abandoned her husband, the poet Paul Éluard, to be with Dalí. Parisian society buzzed with gossip. This Russian femme fatale, stealing away the young surrealist. The surrealist circle itself split. Some admired her, others despised her influence. Breton, already suspicious of Dalí, now accused him of being controlled, corrupted. But Dalí didn't care. Gala gave him the one thing he craved most: absolute devotion. She worshipped his genius, and in return, Dalí placed her above everything, even art itself. In his works, she began to appear again and again, ethereal, erotic, commanding. Gala became the axis of his surreal universe. Their relationship, however, was anything but simple. It was obsessive, toxic, and paradoxical. Dalí, famously plagued by sexual anxieties and a fear of intimacy, often avoided physical consummation. Gala, meanwhile, took lovers, sometimes openly, sometimes secretly. Dalí not only tolerated it, he seemed to need it, weaving his jealousy into his art and his persona. He painted her as saint and sinner, Madonna and whore, goddess and monster. What outsiders saw as humiliation, Dalí interpreted as fuel. "It is precisely my weakness," he once said, "that gives me my strength." Gala's infidelities, far from breaking him, drove him deeper into his obsessions, his dreams, his delirium. But there was another, more pragmatic side to Gala. She was a strategist. Where Dalí was chaotic, she was calculating. She secured galleries, negotiated contracts, and transformed Dalí from a scandalous surrealist into a global brand. Every outrageous stunt, every headline, every sale, behind it, there was Gala pulling strings. And Dalí, for all his bravado, admitted it freely. "Without Gala, I am nothing." Together, they became an inseparable duo, both feared and admired. When Dalí staged his first major exhibition in Paris, Gala stood by his side, ensuring critics noticed, ensuring collectors paid attention. Slowly, the world began to see Dalí not just as another surrealist, but as the surrealist, the one who embodied madness, genius, and spectacle all at once. But their partnership also came at a price. Dalí became increasingly alienated from Breton and the surrealist group. His obsession with money, fame, and publicity, fueled and managed by Gala, was seen as betrayal. "Evita dollars," they sneered again. And yet, Dalí laughed, because with Gala, those dollars were flowing faster than ever. By the end of the 1930s, Dalí and Gala had forged something terrifying and beautiful, a partnership that blurred the line between love and exploitation, devotion and domination. To Dalí, she was a goddess. To others, she was a parasite. But to history, their union would become one of the strangest, most enduring love stories in art. And as war loomed on the horizon, pushing Europe into darkness once again, Dalí and Gala prepared to do what they always did: turn crisis into opportunity and scandal into legend. The outbreak of World War II shattered the world Dalí and Gala had built in Europe. Paris, once the epicenter of surrealism, was now under threat. Spain, still suffocating under Franco's regime, was no safe haven either. For Dalí and Gala, the answer was obvious: escape to America. In 1940, they boarded a ship bound for New York. For many European artists, exile meant obscurity. But for Dalí, it became the stage he had always dreamed of. America was a land of spectacle, of advertising, of celebrity culture, and Dalí was perfectly equipped to thrive in it. From the moment he arrived, he turned himself into a sensation. His mustache, his eccentric clothes, his bizarre pronouncements. Everything was calculated to attract attention. He gave press interviews that sounded like riddles, walked through the streets carrying strange objects, and staged exhibitions that felt more like performances than displays of art. New York, a city hungry for distraction in the midst of war, devoured him. Reporters followed him, Society women wanted him at their parties, and collectors paid huge sums for his canvases. Dalí, the strange outsider mocked in Paris, became a darling of American culture. But it wasn't just the art world he conquered. Dalí saw that America worshipped cinema, and he wanted in. Hollywood, with its dream factories, was in many ways already surreal. Dalí wanted to push it further. In 1945, he collaborated with Alfred Hitchcock on Spellbound. Hitchcock, the master of suspense, needed a dream sequence that felt truly unsettling. Dalí delivered. Towering eyes, faceless men, endless corridors, and melting landscapes. It was a sequence unlike anything audiences had seen, proof that surrealism could bleed into mainstream cinema. A year later, Walt Disney approached him. Together, they began work on a project called Destino, an animated short where Dalí's surreal figures would dance with Disney's whimsical characters. The collaboration was too strange to survive the studio system of the 1940s, and the project was shelved for decades. But the very idea that Dalí, the bizarre Spanish painter, could collaborate with Disney proved just how far his influence had spread. Dalí wasn't just painting, he was branding himself. He appeared in fashion magazines, designed shop windows for department stores, created jewelry, even published a cookbook decades later. Everything became part of the Dalí spectacle. Critics sneered, accusing him of selling out, of reducing surrealism to a circus. But Dalí smiled, twirling his mustache. To him, art and commerce were inseparable. "The secret of my influence," he said, "has always been that it remained secret." For Gala, America was a gold mine. She managed contracts, pushed Dalí toward lucrative commissions, and secured their financial stability. Dalí painted portraits of millionaires' wives, designed extravagant stage sets, and turned every commission into a performance. What some saw as shameless, Dalí saw as genius. He was bending the capitalist machine to serve his art. But America also transformed his art itself. His canvases grew larger, more theatrical, filled with religious imagery, nuclear explosions, and references to scientific discoveries. Dalí declared himself a nuclear mystic, fusing Catholic symbolism with atomic physics, claiming to capture both God and science on the same canvas. Some critics rolled their eyes. Others were captivated. Either way, Dalí was impossible to ignore. By the late 1940s, Dalí and Gala had become celebrities in their own right. They traveled in limousines, stayed at the St. Regis Hotel, and mingled with the richest families of New York. Dalí was no longer just an artist. He was a cultural icon. And yet, beneath the spectacle, something deeper was at play. Dalí never forgot the trauma of war. While his antics grabbed headlines, his canvases carried echoes of violence, destruction, and exile. In the Face of War, 1940, he painted a haunting skull, its eye sockets filled with endless skulls, its mouth locked in eternal scream. Behind the glitter, there was always terror. Dalí had escaped Europe's flames, but he carried them in his brush. As the war ended and the world shifted into a new atomic age, Dalí reinvented himself once again. The surrealist provocateur of the 1930s became something new, the mystical nuclear painter. He declared that just as physicists were splitting atoms, he would split reality, combining science, religion, and art into a single vision. His paintings grew monumental. Gone were the small, intimate canvases of his youth. Now he painted enormous works, filled with exploding bodies, levitating figures, and religious icons suspended in cosmic voids. To Dalí, this was the only way to respond to a world where Hiroshima had changed everything. One of his most famous works from this period, the Madonna of Port Liget, shocked audiences. It depicted the Virgin Mary, but fractured, her torso a window into infinity, her body suspended in midair, surrounded by atomic fragments. For Dalí, this was the ultimate union of Catholic faith and atomic science. Matter and spirit both broken open, both revealed to contain hidden universes. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Some accused him of cheap sensationalism. Others hailed him as a prophet of the New Age. Dalí didn't care. Controversy was his oxygen. He leaned into his Catholic roots, which had always lingered beneath his flamboyance. In the post-war years, he painted crucifixions unlike any ever seen. Christ levitating above the earth, viewed from impossible perspectives, suspended in cosmic light. In Christ of St. John of the Cross, the crucifixion is seen from above, the body floating in darkness over a serene bay. No blood, no agony, just transcendence. For Dalí, religion was no longer just ritual. It was theater. It was mystery. And most importantly, it was a canvas for his imagination. But alongside religion came science. Dalí was fascinated by DNA, the double helix newly discovered in the 1950s. He declared it the most beautiful spiral in the universe and filled his notebooks with sketches of molecules, atoms, and galaxies. He proclaimed that his mission was to merge the discoveries of modern physics with the visions of Renaissance masters. "I want to become classic," he said, "and I want to be eternal." It was an audacious claim, but Dalí lived for audacity. Gala remained at the center of it all. Now in middle age, she became almost queen-like, draped in jewels, treated as Dalí's muse and manager. He painted her repeatedly, sometimes as the Madonna, sometimes as a goddess, sometimes as the eternal figure who anchored his turbulent genius. Their relationship was strange, complicated, at times cold, but unbreakable. Without Gala, Dalí's empire might have crumbled. The 1950s and 1960s turned him into something larger than life. He wasn't just an artist anymore. He was a phenomenon. Dalí staged lectures where he showed up in a diving suit, gasping for air until someone remembered to unscrew the helmet. He gave television interviews where he spoke in riddles, declaring, "I am not strange. I am just not normal." He became a master of self-parody, turning himself into a living artwork. The world couldn't look away. America loved him, Europe mocked him, but everywhere his presence was impossible to ignore. His mustache, his voice, his stare. They became symbols as recognizable as his paintings. And yet, behind the spectacle, his canvases kept growing darker, more apocalyptic. In the disintegration of the persistence of memory, he returned to his most famous painting, The Melting Clocks, but shattered it into fragments, as if even time itself had been blown apart by the atomic bomb. Dalí had turned his personal obsessions into global reflections. Faith, science, sex, death, spectacle, all collided on his canvases, creating a new kind of art that felt both timeless and utterly of its age. By the 1960s, he was no longer just Salvador Dalí the painter. He was Salvador Dalí the myth, a figure who blurred the line between genius and parody, prophet and clown, saint and showman. And he knew it. He reveled in it. He cultivated it. Every gesture, every word, every painting was designed not just to be seen, but to be remembered. For Dalí, immortality wasn't just an afterlife, it was a brand. By the 1960s, Salvador Dalí was no longer just a painter. He was everywhere, on magazine covers, on television screens, in advertising campaigns. His name alone could fill theaters, sell books, and ignite gossip columns. He had transformed himself into what he always wanted to be, a global spectacle. Dalí became the ultimate self-promoter. He cultivated his mustache like a weapon, waxed to impossible points, each curl a performance in itself. He gave interviews where he spoke slowly, dramatically, emphasizing his own brilliance with every syllable. Sometimes he carried an anteater on a leash through the streets of Paris. Sometimes he appeared in public in a full suit of armor. For Dalí, reality was a stage, and he was the star. Television loved him. He made appearances on American shows like The Tonight Show, where he baffled audiences with surreal riddles and eccentric behavior. On one occasion, He poured water onto the floor mid-interview, insisting it was art. The hosts didn't know how to react, but the cameras adored him. In the advertising world, Dalí lent his face, his art, and his aura to everything from perfumes to chocolate. He designed the famous Chupa Chups lollipop logo, turning a candy into an eternal brand. He collaborated with fashion designers, created surreal jewelry, and even designed stage sets for ballets and operas. Critics sneered. They said Dalí had sold out, that he had turned his genius into a circus. But Dalí only laughed. "I don't sell out," he said. "I sell Dalí." And the public couldn't get enough. Tourists flocked to Cadaqués and Port Ligat just for a glimpse of him in Gala. He became a living tourist attraction, his presence as magnetic as his paintings. In New York, he mingled with celebrities, Andy Warhol, Elvis Presley, and even members of the Rolling Stones. Warhol admired him deeply, calling Dalí a pioneer of the idea that an artist could be more famous than their art. Dalí saw in Warhol a reflection of himself, another master of spectacle who blurred the line between sincerity and performance. But while the cameras focused on his antics, Dalí never stopped painting. He worked obsessively, often producing canvases into the early morning hours, each brushstroke a declaration that he was still, above all, a painter. His works of the 1960s and 1970s fused his nuclear mysticism with surreal showmanship, giant canvases filled with exploding landscapes, religious visions, and cosmic imagery. Still, not everything was glitter and applause. Dalí's obsession with fame sometimes came at a cost. Younger critics dismissed him as a parody of himself. Some art historians argued that his best work was behind him, that he had become more performer than creator. But for Dalí, the criticism only fed his legend. Controversy was oxygen. Without it, he would suffocate. And then there was Gala. Now elderly, she remained both muse and tyrant, fiercely protective of Dalí's empire. Their relationship had become more business partnership than romance, but Dalí worshipped her all the same. He painted her again and again, calling her his gradiva, his guide through life. Behind every public spectacle stood Gala, orchestrating, negotiating, controlling. Dalí leaned harder into religion and mysticism, declaring that Catholicism was the only true avant-garde. He staged exhibitions like spiritual rituals, presenting himself as both prophet and entertainer. In one moment, he would speak of atoms and DNA. In the next of angels and saints, blending science and faith into a single, dazzling narrative. By the 1970s, he was both ridiculed and revered. He was no longer just part of the art world. He was part of global culture. His mustache was a brand, his voice an icon, his presence unforgettable. Even those who hated his art couldn't ignore him. Dalí had achieved something very few artists ever do. He had turned himself into a myth while still alive. He wasn't just painting canvases. He was painting himself into history. Every entrance, every joke, every scandal was a brushstroke. Every collaboration, every interview, every public stunt was part of a larger canvas. A canvas where the subject was not a melting clock or a cosmic Christ, but Salvador Dalí himself. And that canvas was almost complete. By the late 1970s, the fire of Salvador Dalí still burned, but the body that housed it was failing. The once flamboyant showman, who had marched through cities with exotic animals and spoken in riddles to stunned audiences, now moved slower, his hands sometimes trembling, his voice weaker. Time, the very concept he had painted in melting clocks, was finally melting him. Gala, his lifelong muse and protector, had aged too. Their relationship had grown complicated, even bitter at times, as she grew more controlling, managing his public appearances and finances with an iron hand. Dalí still adored her, but the woman he once called his goddess was now frail, her power waning as illness consumed her. When Gala died in 1982, Dalí shattered. His world collapsed. The woman who had guided his life for over 50 years, who had shaped his image, who had been his shield and inspiration, was gone. Dalí retreated into silence, his flamboyant energy drained. Friends said he wandered his home like a ghost, muttering to himself, his mustache still waxed but his eyes hollow. Yet even in grief, he remained Dalí. He declared that Gala had not left him, that she still appeared in his dreams, whispering ideas. He spoke of building a mausoleum where he would one day join her, a surreal palace of eternity. In his solitude, he returned to painting. But his canvases grew darker, more fragmented, reflecting a mind haunted by absence. Illness struck him cruelly. In 1984, a fire in his bedroom left him badly burned, his health permanently damaged. He spent his final years confined to a wheelchair, unable to paint with the same ferocity. For an artist who once defined himself through spectacle and creation, it was a living torment. Yet Dalí, ever the master of myth, refused to let the world see only weakness. He received visitors dressed impeccably, his mustache still defiant, his words still eccentric. He once said, "I am not dying. I am becoming immortal." As Spain emerged from dictatorship into democracy, Dalí became a national treasure, celebrated as one of the greatest artistic minds the country had ever produced. He was awarded titles, honors, and tributes. But behind the ceremonies, Dalí felt the loneliness of being trapped inside a body that no longer obeyed him. He spent his last years in the Torre Galatea in Figueres, part of the Dalí Theater Museum he had designed himself. Surrounded by his works, he lived in a surreal mausoleum of his own making, as if he had already stepped into his afterlife. The museum was not just an exhibition space. It was a stage, a final performance where Dalí was both the artist and the artwork. Visitors who saw him in those years described the atmosphere as heavy, as if they were watching a star fade in slow motion. His once piercing eyes seemed distant, trapped between memory and dream. But even in decline, Dalí radiated a strange aura, as if the myth he had created around himself would not allow him to vanish quietly. On January 23, 1989, Salvador Dalí died of heart failure. He was 84 years old. True to his word, he was buried in the crypt of his theater museum in Figueres, beneath a great dome he had designed. His final resting place was not a quiet cemetery or a family plot. It was a stage, ensuring that even in death, Dalí would remain a spectacle. His funeral was attended by kings, politicians, and admirers, but Dalí had planned it so that his greatest audience would come not once, but forever. Every visitor who entered his museum would, in some way, be visiting his grave. Every eye that looked upon his works would be keeping him alive. Dalí's death was not an end, but a transformation. Just as he had promised, he became immortal, not through science, not through faith, but through myth. The man who bent reality into dreams had bent death into legacy. Salvador Dalí is gone, but his shadow stretches longer than ever. His name, his image, his art, they refuse to fade. Today, Dalí is not just a painter studied in galleries. He is a brand, a myth, a symbol of the limitless power of imagination. What makes Dalí so haunting is not only his talent, but his refusal to live by the rules of ordinary men. He blurred every boundary between genius and madness, art and spectacle, love and obsession, reality and dream. He made his life itself a canvas, painting it with scandal, laughter, and shocking brilliance. Walk into the Dalí Theater Museum in Figueres, and you can still feel it. The walls drip with strangeness, the ceilings swirl with cosmic visions, and beneath it all lies Dalí's body, as if he is daring visitors to ask themselves whether he is truly dead. To step inside is to step into Dalí's mind, a place where time melts, where gravity bends, where logic gives way to dream. But his legacy is not confined to Spain. Across the world, Dali's works hang in the most prestigious museums. The Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Tate in London, the Reina Sofia in Madrid. Millions of people, decades after his death, still stand before his canvases in awe, trying to decode his visions, trying to understand the man who refused to be understood. Yet Dali's influence goes far beyond museums. He anticipated the modern world of celebrity culture, where artists are not only defined by their work, but by their persona. Before Andy Warhol, before Lady Gaga, before Elon Musk, there was Dalí. He was the original showman, proving that personality could be performance, and that myth could be as powerful as the art itself. For some, he remains controversial. Critics accuse him of vanity, of chasing fame at the expense of depth. Others point to his eccentric political statements, his ambiguous loyalties, his tendency to provoke without explanation. But whether adored or despised, one thing is undeniable: no one forgets Dalí. That, perhaps, was his greatest triumph. Dalí feared obscurity more than death. He once said, "Don't bother about being modern. Unfortunately, it is the one thing that, whatever you do, you cannot avoid." He knew time would catch him, but he also knew his myth would outrun it. Today, Dalí lives not only in his canvases, but in pop culture, in fashion, in cinema, in music videos, even in memes. His melting clocks have become one of the most recognized images in the history of art. His mustache, sharp, absurd, defiant, still inspires imitation. His name itself has become shorthand for the surreal. And so, when we look back at that photo of Salvador Dalí in 1965 with his ocelot, what are we really seeing? Not just an eccentric man with a strange pet. We are seeing an empire of myth condensed into a single frame. The man who turned his life into art stares back at us, daring us to decide. Was he a genius or a fraud, a prophet or a madman, a clown or a god? The truth is, Dalí was all of these at once. That is why he endures. He showed us that art is not only about beauty, it is about disruption, shock, memory, and dream. He forced us to question the nature of reality, to see the strangeness in the ordinary, and to accept that sometimes the most powerful truths come wrapped in absurdity. Dalí's story is not one of quiet genius. It is a storm, a spectacle, a carnival of contradictions. And perhaps that is the final lesson he leaves behind. Life itself is surreal. The question is not whether we can control it, but whether we can embrace it, bend it, and transform it into something unforgettable. As long as clocks melt, as long as myths matter, as long as art dares to shock and fascinate, Salvador Dalí will never truly die. He will remain eternal, defiant, and unforgettable. The man who painted time has escaped it.